event, aside from World War II, is the concentration camps and the Holocaust by bullets and Holocaust in the camps. And we're going to have to save all that stuff for next time. I just want to reiterate something that Dr. Tod said last week or 2 weeks ago, is that this stuff is pretty dark stuff. It really is. It's a bit heavy, but there's a great value to learning this. But whenever there's darkness, there's always some rays of light that are shining through. There's always some hope. There's always beautiful little acts of sacrifice that are made. There are always heroes, even hiding in the shadows at times. So we have to sometimes look for the glimmers of hope. And for me personally, in researching this and writing all this, one of the things that it's really touched my heart is there's the little phrase, never again. We never want to see something like this happen again, right? To any people, whether it's to Jewish people, whether it's to anybody of any race or any religion of that nature. It shows you really what can happen when you pull out the rug or you pull out the chessboard or the checkers board. And in some sense, the Lord, the training wheels that he has for us in respecting one another as human beings, it really gets to be, in some sense, an ideology can completely take over, and then anything goes. It can blind one to oneself and one's prejudices, and then it can lead to tremendous violence, and then its worst case, to an extermination, or at least an attempt to exterminate an entire people. Just so that you know, Dr. Tod and I are just kind of going back and forth a little bit. This is kind of a two-session parentheses, if you want to put it that way. Kind of just taking a camera and zooming in on Nazi Germany in the 30s and kind of early 40s, and looking at their strategies of dealing with the people that they could not stand, right, or that they considered as subhuman or even enemies of the German Reich. This is kind of I don't want to say, it's not a commercial break, but there's a parentheses, and then we're going to get back to the war and specifically the American contribution to the war, because I know many of you have, some of you may have been parents, but I know many of you have grandparents and great-grandparents that have made tremendous sacrifices and contributions to this war for what we believe is beautiful, good, true, and the gift of freedom and human dignity and the right to worship and right to love and respect and all that. So we have some D-Day stuff and kind of the European theater, and then I'll cover sort of the Pacific theater and then the atomic bomb. And then we will wrap up this course with some kind of what can we take away from this? I mean, what can we learn from this? And maybe try to apply it a little bit today, but just what's some historical lessons we can take away from this. Also, just so you know, this is very soft pencil, not pen, not ink, very soft pencil, can be erased. We're talking a little bit about the possibility of doing a little series on the Cold War next fall, right? So next fall. I am a little hesitant because I'm nowhere near in the camp of Dr. Worner on this, so I would have to do some pretty significant research in this particular area. It can be done, right? And he's pretty well versed, but this would be near and dear to our hearts in some sense because so many of us, you've lived through this, right? Especially when you're little kids. And so to see this perspective of what can we learn in this particular post-World War II era, which is all the way up through the late 80s and 90s. Today, I just want to look at the progression or regression of prejudice of anti-Semitism, which unfortunately we see rising significantly today, that this movement all the way to the concentration camps in the early 40s. Just as God and his kingdom have certain strategies with kind of truth and self-sacrifice and adherence to what's good and beautiful and true, so evil and the evil one have a kind of structure, a kind of scaffolding, a kind of strategy in the way it wants to operate, in the way it wants to grow, in the way it wants to dominate, in the way it wants to twist and distort reality and the truth, right, for its own purposes, right, to dominate in some sense that are there. So I'm going to start with a little quote from 2009, Archbishop Charles Chaput. He was the Archbishop of Philadelphia. That's where he kind of ended his time. He said that evil preaches tolerance until it is dominant. Then it tries to silence the good, or it tries to suppress the good or stamp out the good. For those of you that are in the medical profession, you know a good healthy body has good healthy cells. And when you find cells that are deformed, cancerous cells, it's concerning because you know that those don't want to just stay isolated. They want to multiply, right? And they eventually want to take over the body, the health of the body. They want to rapidly spread. And the same is true in the nature of evil and the way it wants to spread. So I just created a couple of phases for you. Phase one is when an ideology, and an ideology is just a false vision of reality. It's a false narrative. It's a distortion of the truth of what reality is. It's a false belief system. When it's in the minority or it's still weak, it advocates for tolerance. It says, look, we get a place at the table, right, just like you. Demanding acceptance from a society that may hold different values. It uses the language of pluralism, right, diversity and diverse voices to protect itself while it grows, right? So it needs a cover in some sense. Then, when it starts to take over and it gains power, the ideology becomes dominant, its need for tolerance now vanishes. Instead, it seeks to silence and suppress competing or dissenting viewpoints, particularly those it considers good or virtuous. It begins to dismantle all its opposition. And this is something that Dr. Worner has shown us, how Hitler used democracy in some sense to get into power, to become chancellor, the second position of power, and then systematically begins to dismantle democracy for his own purposes. We are going to see some pretty sinister ways that evil is going to put its boot on the face or the forehead of the Jewish people over a roughly 10 to 12-year period from 1933 to all the way to the end of the war, especially 1944. They will use some economic pressure. They will use some political pressure. They will create new laws. They will use the law as a sledgehammer, in some sense, to pound down and to isolate the Jewish people. They will use social pressure, right? They'll use every form of media possible to form hearts and minds, to shape hearts and minds, to get people to be united against this particular subset of people. And then you'll see a progression. Violence tends to progress, right? It gets more and more aggressive. It will use violence in 1938, November, with Kristallnacht. And then they will also stigmatize the Jewish people by forcing them to wear public visible signs so that this dehumanizes them. And it's a psychological kind of repression of this people by having them wear the yellow Davidic star on the left side, right, on their chest. They'll also put the red J on the passports as well. And we'll see them that if some of the Jews are trying to assimilate with some of these names, they'll make them put the name Israel after the men or Sarah after the women, right, to distinguish them from everywhere else. And eventually they're going to put them into ghettos, and then we know eventually under euphemism, they're going to resettle them or to evacuate them. And next time we're going to talk about a little bit about how evil manipulates and uses language for a cover to do what it wants to really do underneath. And I have like 5 or 6 slides of very sinister, manipulative ways and language that they used was all a cover for underneath, the iceberg underneath in the water of what they really wanted to do, right? Final solution, right? Evacuation, resettlement, reduction in force is a euphemism for just basically work them to death for a couple of weeks. It's a reduction in force. Or reduction in nature that's there. So using all these euphemisms. I just want to say a little something about the Jewish people in general. I said to the people this morning, for whatever reason, and don't ask me why, for years and years and years, I have always, just on a personal level, have a profound respect and a kind of a real love for the Jewish people. I'm fascinated by them, right? I love reading about them. I love their community. I love their dress. I love the fact that they're so serious about the Sabbath. I love the fact that they take their meals seriously, right? Their kosher laws. I love the fact that they're so family-oriented. I love the fact that they stick together, right? Because they know that we have to stick together to survive. So when I'm last time they've been in Holy Land, I kind of try to get to near them as much as I can in their little communities because I enjoy being around them very much. It's a little awkward with the Roman color. They're like, what the heck are you doing here? You know, like, hey, how you doing? I'm like a penguin. We look alike. You got black and stuff too, right? That's there. So I'm fascinated by them, and I have a profound respect for them because they have suffered so much over the years, right? That's there. And I have nothing against them whatsoever. I actually consider them in some sense, there's a spiritual relationship that they're all older brothers and sisters in some sense, right? I want to say in Christ, but it's true, but in terms of covenants, they are older brothers and sisters in terms of God's election. So here's what St. Paul says in Romans 9 about the Israelites. He says, this is where Romans is all about justification. How do I get in right relationship with God? Is it through just being a good person? Is it through goodwill? Is it through doing good works? Is it through the Torah? Or is it through an entrustment of self through the virtue of faith and through baptism that I get into right relationship with God? And so he concludes that it's through the virtue of faith, the entrustment of heart, mind, and will to God, a faithfulness to him, and trusting in him, and a relationship with God. But then he says, well, what about the Jewish people? Like, where are they in all of this? So chapters 9, 10, and 11, he's really kind of looking at the place of the Jewish people in this grand sort of vision, in some sense, of God's overarching plan of salvation. By the way, to get my sort of master's degree in theology, I had to sit down with three then priests who could ask me any question they wanted. How'd you like me on that test? Any theological question you wanted from the 5 years I was in school. And it was Father Cousins, or now Bishop Cousins, on there. Father Bedencourt, now it's Bishop Bedencourt's on there. And the other priest, he's now passed away. But I had two bishops basically on there. And the first question they said, okay, well, Len, what about the Jewish people? Where do they fit in God's plan of salvation? I was like, good grief, this is my first question? You can't say, like, what's my favorite color? Do I like dogs or cats better, Why do you want to be a priest type of thing? So I was like, wow, this is like a huge curve, a slider coming here right away. I said, well, if you look at Romans chapter 9, he's got this image of an olive tree. He's got these natural branches on them, which are the Jewish people. And he says some of these have been, kind of broken off through rebellion and things like that. But he says that God, in his mercy and in his wisdom and providence, can graft those on anytime he wants. And actually, it's very natural, more natural to graft on the natural branch than it is an adopted branch onto that olive tree. So God has not abandoned his covenant with his Jewish people. He says they are the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And from them, right, according to these promises, he made all these promises to Abraham. According to the flesh is the Messiah, right, the anointed one. God who is over all and blessed forever. So Paul is saying that, look, there's a lot of promises, a lot of covenants that were made to this family. They are God's chosen people, and they still are in some sense, right? As through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, David, right, all the way down to Christ, who we believe as Christians or as Catholics is the fulfillment of all of these promises. He is the living Torah, right, the living word. He is the fulfillment of all those covenants of God's worldwide family. So the Jewish people, this is a very important slide actually. The Jewish people are a sacramental sign that God exists and that God acts in and through history. In other words, God is not a deist. A deist is kind of the watchmaker belief that God kind of created the world, he wound it up, and then he just let it go, like a watch. Or he let it go like a toy that you pull the string and just let it go. The Jewish people, their presence says, nope, God holds all of creation in his very heart at every moment, right, in his very being, and he acts in and through history, right, in very significant moments at all the time. They are a reminder of that. They're a sacramental reminder of that. They have a special relationship with God based on the covenants made with Abraham, with Moses, and with King David. Their very existence is kind of a prick on the world's conscience that God and God alone is to be worshipped. and no created thing is to be worshipped. They have that, the Shema is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God and the Lord alone." They are this unique people in an ancient world where paganism just ran rampant, and it was very normal to worship many gods. And you had this peculiar, very small people that said, "That's all ridiculous. There's only one God. And he created the heavens and the earth and all the stars and the seas, and he holds them in being, and he's chosen us to be the light to the all nations." It just irked everybody around them that they were so different. Now we're like, well, that just seems so natural. But now, today, in some sense, they remind us that as a covenant people, they are reminded that we are called to worship and serve the Lord God alone. And not any aspect of creation, whether it's money, possessions, power, honor, pleasure, no ideology, all these false ideologies, all this stuff's created, and he's the Lord of it all. And he deserves to be worshiped. He deserves the center of your heart. He should be the depth of your heart. He should be your first love, your last love. Fascism, communism, any ideology, right? And there's lots of them out there. All this stuff is a distortion of God's good creation. For those who reject God, who have made a God out of their ideology, the Jews afflict their conscience. They are a reminder that you are in rebellion against God. Their presence reminds the world that God alone is God, and his plan of salvation will prevail over all ideologies. And I think, this is my theory, is that sort of modern, secular, tends to be on the progressive side. Why do they hate Jews so much? Is because they themselves have rejected God, and the Jewish people remind them of their rejection and their rebellion of God. And this is why there's a hatred of that particular human race. And this is why they say, you don't even get to exist in your particular country. And we want to, in some sense, we don't want to say it out loud, but we want to wipe you out, right? Because you annoy us and you afflict our conscience. That's there. The historical and current animosity against Jews is a sign of the spiritual warfare that's happening deeper underneath. Given that Jews are central in God's redemptive plan of salvation, Satan's ongoing effort to destroy the Jewish people is really an aggressive lunging at or an aggressive warfare against God himself. Remember, Lucifer is the highest of the angels, part of the seraphim, which is the upper echelon of the choirs of angels that fell, and he and his unclean or demonic spirits are always in rebellion against God. That rebellion against God is an attack on the Jewish people. One example, a couple examples for you. The book of Esther, for some of you who do read the Liturgy of the Hours, you know the Office of Readings just completed the book of Esther, which is a very loved book in the Jewish tradition. It takes place in the 5th century BC, from 483 to 473. The Jewish people have been exiled, right, in Babylon, who's been taken over by Persia. And in Persia, there's a city called Susa, where the Jews live. Many Jews are there living as a community, trying to live their covenant life by a certain kosher laws, keeping the Sabbath, a way of dress. These are the kind of distinctive markers of being Jewish. There's a king, Ahasuerus. He has a minister who's a very evil man. His right-hand man, Haman, wants everybody to worship him and the king. And he comes across a Jew named Mordecai, who's the cousin of Esther. And Mordecai, day after day, does not worship Haman or the statue that's built up. And so he keeps saying, why are you disobeying me? He's like, look, you're not God. I'm not going to worship you. I'm sorry. I refuse to. So out of anger and out of fury, he goes to the king and lies and says, this people, they're against you and against our empire. They're against our way of life. May I have your permission, your seal, your ring, to wipe them out? The king, who's lazy, doesn't really research it, says, sure. I mean, yeah, if they're rebelling against us, yeah, well, go ahead. Here's my blessing. So the entire Jewish people are going to be wiped out at this point. And Mordecai then goes to his younger cousin Esther and says to her, you got to do something. You're the queen. We're all going to get wiped out. Everybody's in a panic. And I'll tell you what, if you don't do something, the Lord will still save us somehow. He'll work around you, and your life won't be spared. So then she, throws on the penitential garments, kind of an Ash Wednesday, in some sense, a retreat, goes to the king, right? The king calls her, and she begins, crying and saying, my whole people are going to be wiped out unfairly and unjustly. Thanks be to God, there's a change of heart from the king. the Jewish people are saved, and then Haman is hung on the very gibbet or the very noose that was meant for Mordecai. And the story is read, right, with a sense of divine providence. This great, massive threat against the Jewish people, going to be completely wiped out. In the daily mass readings, and then also in the month of November, we're going to hear on Sunday masses, we're going to hop into the book of Maccabees, First Maccabees. Again, another huge threat against the Jewish people, because you are to worship us, you're going to be under our thumb, and if you don't sacrifice to us, if you sacrifice, all is well, right? And so it was Mattathias, and then there's his son Judas Maccabeus refuse, and they start that very successful rebellion, and the Jewish people are saved once again. So my point is, there's just periodically throughout history, there's just this diabolical, evil attack against the Jewish people. And there's a lot of suffering, a lot of blood that's shed, but never once does all the Jewish people get wiped out. 20th century, Nazi Germany, as they're growing in power, we see another horrific attack against the Jewish people. Probably the worst human history has ever seen on a scale we have never seen. Ideas have consequences. If you think that ideas stay in university classrooms, you're out of your mind. They spill out of there, they move into business, they move into entertainment, they move into law, and they end up having consequences. And when they're false or bad ideas, they have serious consequences that are very negative for society. In 1933, there were 9.8 million European Jews, or basically 1% or 1.5, 1.7%, a very small percent of the total population. In 1945, get this, 3.8 million European Jews. That's 6 million Jews that are exterminated, either from gassing, from bullets, from disease, from starvation, from maltreatment, whatever it is, horrifically treated. I looked up, I was curious for some comparison. Minnesota's population in 2024 was 5.8 million. You basically wipe out the entire state of Minnesota. With all, it's just, the numbers are just staggering when you start to really think about this stuff. This anti-Semitic ideology was the primary motivation leading to the persecution, the mass murder of Jews. Other target persons, Roma, sometimes pejoratively called gypsies, Poles, people with mental and physical disabilities, people with same-sex attraction, Catholic priests they went to Dachau, they went to Auschwitz as well, Soviet prisoners of war. I mean, the scope was just broad in terms of people that they went after. Slavs and Soviet soldiers were also viewed as subhuman, as Untermensch. About 3.3 million Soviet soldiers died in captivity from 1941 to 1945, primarily from disease and starvation. Again, as Dr. Todd's been pointing out, ideology blinds you. It's like a cancer of the mind. There's no sort of limits to how far it will go in terms of the misery that it will cause. It will allow any number of broken eggs to be broken, human deaths and suffering, to make that utopian omelet. Nazi ideology broke a lot of eggs for that pure Aryan master race. What bugs me also is that so many of these leaders were Catholic. And they disavowed our faith, and they walked away completely, and they renounced it, and they, of course, developed their own religion. It tells me that the importance of authentic catechesis, authentic evangelization that needs to happen. Anti-Semitism is just really prejudice or hatred of the Jewish people. It's been around for over 2,000 years. It's difficult to define because it's like a virus that mutates over time. Historically, it expresses itself in so many contradictory ways. For example, sometimes in history, the Jewish people are hated because you're poor, right? You're lazy and you don't work. But sometimes they're hated because they're rich, right? You're the capitalist, right? You own everything or you run everything. They're also hated because you keep to yourselves and you don't actually assimilate with communities. And then other times they're like, well, you're too cosmopolitan, or you infiltrate culture and business and education and in law, you're overrepresented in these particular things. They're hated because they cling to your ancient religious beliefs and you won't sort of adapt and modernize. You're also hated because you're cosmopolitan and you sometimes they're accused of believing in nothing, right? So on the right, they're hated because you're not seen as part of the social fabric. You're not, patriotic enough. You're not German enough, contrary to the racial and biological unity of a nation. And on the left, they're hated because, well, you're capitalists, right? And you're not communist enough, or you're oppressors of the poor, right? So you have this kind of odd thing with Jewish people, anti-Semitism, that it's like a virus that survives for thousands of years, and it continues to survive by mutating. That's there. My argument is really this is something deeper is going on, something spiritual. There's something demonic that's actually going on, right? A hatred of God. You probably picked this up in your readings here, and I also picked up some of my research here. Kind of traditionally throughout the Middle Ages, the Jewish people were heavily persecuted, not because of their skin or because of the blood or because of their identity or because of biology, but they were hated because of their beliefs. So really anti-Semitism is not really correct. It's really anti-Judaism, right? Because they didn't believe in Christ, or they had some very, what people consider different beliefs. They faced legal restrictions, social segregation, scapegoating, and even expulsions from countries. And I just listed some of the dates there when they were kicked out of these particular cultures. I could have put Spain up there as well. The 19th and 20th centuries, though, the kind of camera shifts in some sense. Jewish people are really reviled in the 19th and 20th and 21st century, not so much because of their beliefs, but because of their identity, of their biology, of who they are. Jews are viewed as an inferior race, or they don't fit in with the human race, regardless of their beliefs or attempts to assimilate. It's a problem now of existence. We don't even like you as a people, rather than your belief. The phrase Jude blet Jude, a Jew remains a Jew, summarizes their inability to assimilate into a culture or convert to Christianity. In your readings, you knew that, like, for example, Karl Marx said, well, the way we can solve the Jewish problem is if they assimilate and, they kind of abandon this sort of belief system and join the party in some sense, then they'll cease being Jew. And the Germans said, no, a Jew is a Jew. Right? It doesn't matter if you're similar or not. Or if they get baptized and they start to practice the sacraments and are part of the church, they cease being a Jew. And the Nazis said, nope, I don't care what baptismal certificate you give me. A Jew is a Jew, right? Their blood. So, for example, Edith Stein, right, St. Teresa Benedict of the Cross, they moved her up to Holland, right, because, she converted and she's one of our great saints. They went after her as well, right? And they said, well, she's now a Catholic. No, she's still a Jew, right? We're still coming after her. Don't try to pull that on us. A Jew's a Jew, right? So this, in their mind, it's the blood, right? It's the race that's there. And you see more of that today, right, is the hatred of them because of their race. I had to have a little humor in here. I love Fiddler on the Roof. I love Tavier. He says, I know, we are your chosen people. But once in a while, can't you choose someone else, right? So this sense of, this sense of always, a choice that comes with a lot of suffering of the Jewish people. The Fiddler on the Roof is just a phenomenal movie. I just love it. Minnetonka was going to have Fiddler on the Roof just before the pandemic started, and I was so excited to go see it because I think their plays are, generally speaking, pretty well done. But then, of course, the pandemic, it got shut down. So they've never really, to my knowledge, brought it back yet. So I might write a letter to them and say, what are your thoughts about Fiddler on the Roof and bringing that one back? I would love to go see that one. So this Nazi ideology, so superior races had not just the right, now this is critical, we don't just have the right, we have the obligation. We have the moral obligation, a duty to subdue and even exterminate inferior ones. This is a very cancerous belief system. And so what they do is they use this social Darwinism. Darwinism is the survival of the fittest. How do species evolve over time in terms of breeding, and the best characteristics of a particular species begins to dominate, and those traits dominate, and then the weaker part of the species begins to get rooted out. So they just take that and they map that onto biology. They map sociology onto biology, and they use it for their own social and political means. And they say, well, this part of the human race is the fittest, right? The Aryans are the fittest. And actually what the Nazis would do is they would show videos and propaganda how superior parts of the species would dominate the lesser part of the species, like a crab that's stronger and a weaker one would dominate. They say, see, look at this. This is us and this is them. So they would use this kind of pseudoscience to say, it's just science. We're just using science. These are the laws of nature, and we're just using the laws of nature to better the sort of lot of the human race. So basically the same rules apply. So this new science of eugenics, which is the this idea of the best of the human race, right? This kind of, they would force sterilization of sort of the handicapped, those who are psychologically imbalanced, right? And to try to weed out the sort of what they considered to be lesser of human beings, the undesirables, as they would call them, the unfit ones for society, and we'd be prevented from having children. And they would do this before the concentration camps and then also in the concentration camps as well. So they put this social Darwinism into action in the 1930s and in 1940s with their genocidal policies. I did not even know about this before my research. This axion, it looks like T4, but I think it's pronounced Tefir, actually is the way it's pronounced. They created a program that's called this Axion Tefir from 1939 to August of 1941, which was essentially a kind of covert, state-sponsored euthanasia program. And so physicians in the study of eugenics, this kind of the breeding, right, had a mandate to kill anyone deemed to have a life unworthy of living. The program led to involuntary euthanasia, killing hundreds of thousands of mentally ill, elderly, and disabled people, right? And they estimate something like between 200 and 300,000 people that they put in this category were put to death through euthanasia, through this particular program. The physically disabled, those with psychological problems, right? Patients, the chemically ill, even like bombing victims would be in this category, or foreign laborers and things like that we could throw in this category. That's pretty sad and horrific stuff, right? That's there. I found a little picture here of somebody obviously struggling, right? Somebody who is physically very ill being loaded onto the truck, right? Where they're going to be euthanized. That's there. And by the way, there are some policies in our particular state that I vehemently disagree with. And one of them is the euthanasia attempt in our state by some politicians to try to move that forward, which voluntary euthanasia always results in involuntary euthanasia down the road. And I just want to say, I'm not calling you a Nazi. I don't like when people do that. But I do want to say that you have a Nazi mentality, which is let's get rid of all the people who are unworthy of life, all those who are a burden on our society. And what ends up happening, as those of you in the medical field know this, is they start to pressure you to say, your family actually would want this. This is the charitable thing to do. Do you really want to use all the resources that could be used for other people? It's a charitable thing to do to just let us assist you to take your life, right? This is very, very sinister and diabolical stuff. Christians should fight this tooth and nail. Absolutely fight this tooth and nail. It's an offense against human dignity, and it is wrong, pure and simple. And there's always a slippery slope that goes down in this. I know Dr. Todd wrote beautiful articles on this from a medical perspective as showing this is absolutely contrary to our profession of do no harm, right? We're in the profession of healing people, not of killing people. It's contrary to what we are as physicians, what we're supposed to be doing in helping people. Now, here's our roadmap, our GPS system: shaping public belief, scapegoating, using symbols and slogans to unite, inciting fear. They're not only subhuman, but they're enemies of the state. Boycotting Jewish businesses, using the legal system as a heavy boot or a handcuff on the people. Hiding your intentions. I didn't know about this. In 1936, when the Olympic Games came to Berlin, they hid their intentions. They toned things down a lot, right, until they get legitimized in the world's eyes. They use propaganda, they use violence, they stigmatize the Jews, and then they physically segregated them into Jewish ghettos, getting them ready for the total extermination. By the way, it's not like in 1933, they were like, oh, we all know what we're going to do here. We all know we're going to kill all the Jews. This was a horrific regression that happened. Even like in 1939, 40, still was not quite clear what they were going to do with the Jewish people. So when they're running people through these gas chambers, they probably had no idea that this is where the path took them based when they started in 1933. I tell you all the time, those of you in my parish, every path leads somewhere. No matter how fast or slow you walk on that path, you're going to end up where that path takes you. You have to make sure you're on the right path. It's very, very, very critical. So the first thing you're going to see happen here in terms of socially excluding a particular group is you create an in-group or an ideal group or a good group, and then you create an outside group, a subhuman or a dangerous group. Wherein the former are held up as beautiful, noble, good, orderly, while the latter are isolated, demonized, and presented as dangerous. You use rhetoric, use scapegoating, use the legal system, use propaganda to serve. You create this dichotomy between an ideal inside group and an unideal or an undesirable outside group. Human beings tend to do this a lot, right? You exclude certain groups based on certain characteristics. So I just create a little chart here. Germans look for ways to separate Jews from society, whether it's through economics, the political realm, civil society, culture. And I'm not going to repeat that again. Then they exclude them. They move them to ghettos. By the way, then they profit off them as well, right? Because they'll start to plunder their possessions. It's kind of a reverse exodus in some sense. They'll take their homes, their furniture, their clothing, their jewelry and stuff. So this is why a lot of the Germans said, well, it's not ideal, but, we get the profit off this stuff, right? We get some stuff from them. And the Germans could also use it for their war machine, right? To sell some of this stuff to help finance the war. And then they moved them to extermination camps to get rid of the society. So you can't read this here, but for those of you that do get the slides online, I found this phenomenal graphic on the 10 stages of genocide. Number one, I just mentioned, is you have this classification of us versus them. You have this symbolization, this visual differences. Now, in the 30s, it didn't happen in this order, but I was giving you all the things that can be done. You have this discrimination. You deny them of civil rights. You have this dehumanization. You paint them with brush strokes, with name calling. You then train your own people, right? Your own sort of in-group for violence and for domination. You polarize through propaganda. You prepare and you use euphemistic language to do this, right? To soften it, and you use covert language. And then you begin persecuting, putting them into ghettos. And then you move towards the mass systematic murder of them. And the one that I really caught my attention was number 10. And then you deny it. And then you cover up the evidence. And then you say, well, I don't know what you're talking about. What are you talking about? This is nothing. This didn't happen, right? And you see, unfortunately, some of this starting to happen today, right? The denial. So that's part of one of the stages of the genocide process. There's my little goat for you. So when bad things happen to a group, its members can ask one of two questions. What did we do wrong? That's a very good question, right? That begins the healing process. That begins the conversion process. That begins the creative process for getting better. Or the unhealthy question is, who did this to us? That's scapegoating. You create a victim mentality. The entire fate of the group depends on which of the two questions it asks. The first question begins the healing and the process of moving forward. The second one defines itself as a victim, and then it begins to demonize a particular group. Historically, Jews have always been the most conspicuous, or they stand out as most clearly visible of the non-Christian groups in Europe. Today, of course, right, they stand out in the Middle East as the most conspicuous non-Muslim country in the Middle East, right? And they are the most hated by the surrounding countries. Anti-Semitism is the world's warning that freedom, authentic freedom, human dignity, and tolerance of differences are being threatened. It might begin with the Jews, but I can tell you what, it won't stop there, right? If you let that entire group be persecuted, it is only a matter of time before they will come your way as well. And remember what Dr. Tod said to you. He said, if you think that Germany is just going to stop at the Jews, you're out of your mind. They were waiting till things were done, and they're going to come after the Christians next, right, that opposed to them, especially Catholics, right? It was only a matter of time before they started coming after Catholics as well. Anti-Semitism, there's a key line, is a litmus test for the health of a society. When society is healthy, anti-Semitism tends to be low. When society becomes unhealthy, like a virus, anti-Semitism rises and the attacking begins. You can see the unhealthiness of our society and in the world as all these different attacks now. We're seeing more and more in anti-Semitism in the United States and beyond, showing the unhealthiness of our society. Anti-Semitism increases during unhealthy times. Extreme politic groups tend to do better. And I'm saying that not just because it's November 4th and an off election year, but it is very scary in some sense when you see these fringes, whether left or right, starting to gain traction right in there. When there's unhealthy times, the crazy fringes, when things are healthy, nobody listens to those. But when things are unhealthy, they say, well, that sounds kind of cool, actually. What do you got going on there? It's really scary, actually, what begins to happen, whether it's left or right. I just heard a podcast yesterday. I'm starting to hear a lot on the left, but on the right as well. There's some really, really crazy things that are beginning to creep into the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party. That both has to be resisted, that really hard edges there that's very, very, very destructive of our society. Now, the use of symbols, these are meant to unify, right? And they're meant to create a sense of cohesion in the society, a sense of shared identity, a sense of belonging, a sense of shared history and what we value the most. It's supposed to invite a lot of strong emotional response to them and a kind of a way of understanding the world. So that you know, as we mentioned before, the swastika, which has a lot of emotional response, it's really a symbol of tremendous evil, was designed by Adolf Hitler himself in 1920. The red is the kind of social dimension aspect of it, and that's a very strong color, right? He's not dumb, right? He doesn't choose a weak color there. He chooses a very strong color. Red's a very strong, kind of fiery color. White is nationalism, right, for the German Reich. And then he's got the swastika, which is for Aryanism, or the Aryan human race. And by the way, watching a documentary on Hitler as a boy and growing up and things of that nature, he was in a monastery school as a young boy. And on the outside of that monastery school, above the door, there was a cross, and it had just tiny little extensions on it, and I can't remember the order. Do you remember what order it was, Dr. Todd? It was an order, and that's where he got the idea for that. So all he did is he extended the little extensions on it to create kind of a wheel-like motion, and it's supposed to be a sense of progress, right? We are the party of progress. We are the party that's going to revitalize and bring Germany sort of back in line, right? Bring it back to life again. So, and they just splash this all over the place. That's there. What I'm always bothered by, every June, obviously I love those struggling with sexual issues of that nature, but you see the rainbow flags splashed all over the place every June, right? Store windows, TV, everywhere. That's a strategy. That's a strategy, right? To get you to say, you should belong to us. And if you don't, the name calling starts, right? Just realize that's a strategy, right? To try to create a social cohesion there. And I just simply say very calmly, appreciate you, appreciate that yet. I do not agree. God has given us a certain sexuality, and it's a way of, and when we live our certain sexuality this way, that's the way we flourish as human beings. That's the way God has intended us to be. I will always love you, but I will not agree. And I will tolerate you. I won't persecute you. I won't call you names. I will love you as a human being. But that does not mean I'm going to agree with you. It reminds me of growing up, my mother, right? My son, I love you to death. I do not agree with some of the decisions you're making. That's okay. You don't have to agree with all the decisions, right? It's called tolerance. I tolerate you. I don't persecute you, but it doesn't mean I have to agree with you, right? And I can dialogue with you and I can argue with you as well. They would use slogans. The Jews are our misfortune. In other words, they're the cause of all the problems. Jews are the parasites. They're the vermin. They're a disease on the people and to be killed. The Jew is a cheat, right? This kind of the Jewish businesses, right? The capitalist sort of claim. Behind the enemy powers, the Jew proposed Jews with the allied powers. They're the ones who are really behind this, right? The conspiracy sort of theory that you see here. The Jewish plot against Europe, right? They're here to take over, in some sense, our lives. No Jew can be a citizen, right? The impossibility of just kind of being united with us. This was the part of the party platform, the Nazi in the 1920s. Jews are therefore not welcome. They would put these signs, right, in certain restaurants or in public parks and to really make them feel ostracized from society. In 1933, again, Jews are a very tiny minority, less than 1% or so of the population. With the Nazi takeover, you start to see this emigration. The ones who are starting to say that can get out, right, and have a means to get out, are starting to see kind of the writing on the wall. And they're starting to say, this is not really safe for us anymore, right? This is not a pleasant environment to be. So you start to see a drop in them. In 1933, I did a little research here in terms of Jewish, how successful they are in the various areas. First of all, they live mostly in urban areas. Like almost 3/4 are living in the big cities of Germany. But you look at how for a people that's like 1 to 1.5% of the population, they, to their credit, are very successful, right? There's just something about sort of the work ethic, the intellectual capacity, the aptitude of them. There's something really noble about this. 1933, 50% of private banks are Jewish-owned. In 1930s, Jewish doctors made up about 16% of all doctors. Jewish doctors held nearly 40% of the medical professions by 1933. Jewish students are 3.5% of all German university. In the 1930s, Jews made up between a quarter to maybe almost a third of the legal profession in Germany. Get this one, in Berlin, maybe half of lawyers were Jewish. Holy smokes, right? All the lawyer jokes that are out there, Jews own 100,000 businesses across various sectors, retail stores, factories, professional offices, large corporations in Germany, really successful. By 1938, Jewish-owned stores had fallen by 80% to only 9,000. I mean, the Nazi policies, the legal policies, were just crushing for the Jewish people. Nazi measures were detrimental to their businesses. So the first thing is the economic. Let's go after the pocketbook, right? Let's just show them that, just remind you who's in charge, right? This is just shortly, Hitler takes charge in January 1933, so we're just talking a couple months, 3 months afterward. They're already starting their sort of plan, and they begin boycotting on April 1st, things like 10 o'clock in the morning, Jewish businesses such as shops, warehouses, banks, doctors, offices, law firms. It's a propaganda stunt, right? To show look, this is the kind of, you don't want to shop here, right? This is a threat to us. They would have Nazi party members, SA, paramilitaries be standing outside to kind of intimidation that's there, Jewish outside these stores, and to deter customers from going in. They would have signs that would say, for example, Germans, defend yourselves, presenting them as an enemy or a threat. Don't buy from the Jews. Here is a little bit of Jewish, I would say, sense of humor, or a little bit of divine sense of humor. The boycott was largely unsuccessful. Why? Because it took place on a Saturday. It's like, good grief, use your head a little bit. At least have some common knowledge of it. It's the Sabbath. Stores aren't even open, you dingbats. That's there, right? Why not choose another day, right? The Jews yeah, go ahead, put your sign out there. We're not open anyway, you dummy, right? So this kind of good grief. The Nazis placed economic pressure on Jewish businesses throughout the Nazi era as a way to economically isolate and damage these particular enterprises. The single boycott precursor was really kind of a sacramental sign to what's coming. Throughout 1933 and 1934, Jewish businesses were denied access to markets, government contracts, and they were forbidden to advertise. By the way, this is a little kind of side note here. 1933, outside the town of Dachau, what is the SS? They're establishing the first concentration camp. Now, it's not for Jewish people, it's for political opponents, right, and of that nature, or anybody who's against us. But you already start to see this kind of evil, tremendous evil, bubbling up in the background. We've went over this a number of times here, this kind of the dismantling of democracy. I won't spend too much time here, First of all, we're now a one-party state. All other parties, they're gone. We're going to consolidate our power. We're going to pass laws to grant government authority without submitting laws to the Reichstag, which is their government parliament, to dismantle democracy. We're going to suppress any opposition. Any political opponents will be arrested. We're going to establish a police state. Freedom of the press, speech, assembly were abolished, and a state of emergency is declared. We're going to censor so-called un-German things on the news or radio or in films or un-German books. We're going to use propaganda techniques, and we're going to run it all the way through culture in rallies and films and posters to spread our ideology to gain public support. We're going to use legislation, laws, right, to exclude Jews from public life. And we're finally going to get you into ghettos, and we're going to resettle you to quote-unquote better life. And of course, we all know what that meant. Here, look at this picture. So they would have these big, huge book-burning rallies, right, to create uniformity, and these un-German books, or these Jewish books. And I came across this, is a pretty famous quote here: where they have burned books, they will end in burning human beings, right? German Jewish poet, Heinrich Heine. That's there. So there's a series that I just love called The World at War in the 1970s. And they have footage, and what I love about it is so much footage from World War II, and you can watch one of these book burning, and they quote this, right? Where they have burned books, they will end up by burning human beings. Let's look at some legislation now. Along with economic pressure, the Nazis used a legal system to segregate the Jews from the Aryan society and to abrogate their political, legal, and civil rights. So the first of all, they established like 400 decrees and regulations from 1933 to 1939, leaving no stone unturned. The first major law that they're going to implement here is in 1933, and this is called the Law for Restoration of the Professional Civil Service. It's going to exclude Jews from government employment. It's going professions like law, medicine, and journalism. You no longer get to do anything that really has a sort of influential position on society. This law would become the foundation for the very famous Nuremberg race laws of 1935. Now, speaking of them, the Nuremberg race laws, they really institutionalize, right, on an institutional level from the state, racism. And they criminalize intermarriage and relegate Jews to becoming second-class citizens. So there's kind of two main aspects of the Nuremberg race laws. Note, law always has a pedagogical function, right? It teaches, right? That's there. So it teaches our young people. So for example, you can say, well, you shouldn't do that. And they can say, well, why not? It's legal, right? The law says I can do it, right? Now, most laws are just fine, right? They're good, and we need to have them for order. We also know there are sometimes unjust laws, right, that are just simply against reason and against the natural law. And there are certain laws that are just not good for you, even though it might be legal. So these laws are teaching the German people that it's okay, right, to have a sort of racist sort of attitude towards these people and to treat them as subhuman, as an inferior race. So the first one is this kind of redefining citizenship, the Reich citizenship law in the Third Reich. The law defined who is a citizen. And a citizen under this law is of German or related blood. Only they could be Reich citizens. Jews are defined as a separate race and could not be full citizens of Germany. So you basically, in one law, strip them of being German citizens. And this is a huge thing, right? Because we're talking probably generations of people who've considered themselves not only Jewish, but also good Germans, right? Now you're telling me I'm not even a German? I have no rights in society whatsoever. I can't vote. I can't hold certain positions. They have no political rights, and they become stateless in their own country. This is psychologically detrimental to the people. Naturally, the question begins to arise is, how do I define what it means to be a Jew? So, what does that mean? So they come up, look at this chart here they have here, right? It gets very complicated. And they say a person with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents, you are a Jew no matter what. Whether you believe you're a Jew or not a Jew, Your self-identification doesn't matter. It's your lineage, right? Your grandparents. And your grandparent belonging to a religious community. So you got to show documents. Show me your 4 sets of grandparents. The Nazis required individuals to prove their grandparents' racial identities via religious records. So regardless if you're practicing, regardless if you consider yourself a Jew, maybe you haven't stepped in a synagogue for years, you have now just been identified and defined as a Jew based on your grandparents. I'm sure, do you think that went over very well for the Jewish people? Good grief, right? Along with the Jews, the Nazis created 2 other categories of what they called mixed Jewish and German heritage, known as that Mischlinge, right? The Mischlinge, which means hybrid or mixed breeds. So they had degrees of Mischlinge, which is the first degree is if you had 2 Jewish grandparents not belonging to a religious community, you're not married to a Jew yourself, or not born from a marriage with a Jew. After these laws are passed, you're in this category. You're a first degree Mischlinge. You're a mixed breed. Second degree is you just have 1 Jewish grandparent. Now the thing is, you're like, Jesus, this is so technical. What the heck's the point of this? The point is it's going to become very important because when you start to get into ghettos and you start to get into moving people to concentration camps, do we move the person or not? Which class are they in, right? And so there's a debate at the WWII conference is, what do we do with the Mischlinge? Do we include them or not include them? I mean, 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents, absolutely, they're going. But what about the first degree or second degree? So there's a little bit of debate on what to do with this sort of what they called the quote-unquote mixed breed. First degree Mischlinge, stripped of Reich citizenship, could not hold public office, could not vote, restricted in marriage choices, and faced limitations in higher education, and most were more or less treated as Jews. Second degree, 1 grandparent, they're permitted to marry German-blooded citizens, though this was kind of frowned upon. Additionally, many public sphere jobs were inaccessible to even a second degree Mischlinge. The fate of the Mischlinge is debated at the WWII conference among the highest Nazi officials. And the doc recommended that you watch that movie Conspiracy, which is a pretty darn good. There is some debate around the Mischlinge. What do we do with these particular people? The second aspect of the Nuremberg race laws is this law of protection German blood in honor. This law banned marriages and sexual relations between Jews and Aryans. The goal was to preserve the contamination of the Aryan race and prevent race mixing. The law also declared marriages between Jews and non-Jews void. So you imagine getting these laws. Okay, first of all, you're telling me I just lost my citizenship. And then if you're married, right, to it, now you just told me my marriage doesn't count, or it's just invalid, or it's not recognized by the state as well. I mean, psychologically, this is a huge blow. You're telling me I'm nothing. Right? You're telling me I'm certainly basically like an animal, right? I don't count for anything. There's a dehumanization that's happening through the law, using the law as a sledgehammer, as a weapon in some sense. The children, this law goes on to say, born of these ethnically mixed marriages between Jew and Aryan, undermine the purity, so the German said, and the survival of the German race. Those violating the law could be punished with prison time. And then to stick it in their eye, they also added this. The law forbids Jews from employing German women under the age of 45 in their households. In other words, we don't even trust you to have a young German woman in your house. There's such a sinister and a kind of evil eye of everything, a mistrust in some sense of the people. What's the impact here? These laws were devastating on the Jewish people. I mean, they were just debilitating after 1935. Professionally, doctors, lawyers, medical professionals, teachers, no longer allowed to practice their professions. Jewish businesses are boycotted or forcibly taken over by Aryans. Jewish children are expelled from public schools. Jewish families found themselves increasingly isolated. Their social networks and support systems erode under the weight of state-sanctioned discrimination. Economically, Jewish businesses are Aryanized or forcibly transferred to non-Jewish Germans and then given just a fraction of the value at doing so. This expropriation of Jewish wealth is a key component of the Nazi strategy to finance their war machine and impoverish the Jews. So psychologically, you could imagine This is just detrimental for the Jewish people. They had understood themselves as integral parts of the German society for centuries, and now they're treated as pariahs. Their rights, their identities are systematically stripped away. Religiously, their tradition, again, is stomped on. Jewish synagogues are desecrated, Jewish schools are closed, and Jewish institutions are dismantled. These laws really destroyed the fabric of the Jewish culture and way of life in Germany and tried to erase the Jewish culture from the German landscape. If you've seen Schindler's List, Amon Gurth, there's a scene in there, right? They're at the kind of the villa where they treat the Jews like garbage. That's there. He gathers all the high-ranking Nazis around him, and he's got that kind of, it looks like almost, I think, his plans for his villa in his hand. And he talks about the contribution of the Jewish people over hundreds of years and what they've done, and they've become successful. And he says, today, that did not exist. Today is day one. Today is a new day. That never existed. That's the idea here, is we want to create a new day, right? And we're going to use the law to do it. We're going to create a new day, and basically every contribution that you've made to World War I, to our society, it's all wiped away. And we're wiping you off the face. We're getting ready to wipe you off the face of the map. A little quote here: the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Right? The Second Vatican Council kind of said the same thing. If good men and women are not forthcoming, the world is in peril. Good men and women have to step up, and you have to voice your opinion. You have to fight and stand against evil. What's the global reaction here? Little reaction. I mean, unfortunately, it's very tepid from the global community from these laws, these race laws. In general, global reaction is very muted, as many nations are simply concerned with their own problems. They don't want to, poke the bear, so to speak. They have their own economic crisis, their own xenophobic sentiments. Some nations even kind of secretly admired the Nazis for restoring order and getting the economy going in, the stability of Germany. Like, hey, they're actually doing a pretty good job, despite the brutal methods that they employed. The apathy or outright complicity of other nations allowed the Nazis to escalate their anti-Semitic policies throughout the late 1930s and into the Holocaust. Okay, we've been going for an hour and 10 minutes. What do you say we take a little break? Does that sound good? How about, is 10 minutes enough for you? Okay, we'll take a little break for the Berlin Olympics. Okay, guys, I want you to get out of here reasonable amount of time, so we'll hop back in here. Okay. So hopping back in here, I obviously knew something of the anti-Semitism in the 1930s. The one thing I didn't know, though, was that with the 1936 Berlin Olympics coming, I never realized the strategy of the Nazis and how they were going to handle that, right? So you have the world's attention on Berlin, right, sort of the epicenter there, and this stuff's been ramping up for 3 years. You have to make a decision in terms of how are we going to handle this, right? How are we going to present ourselves to the world in some sense? So the 1936 Olympics are fraught, as you can imagine, with controversy. Berlin was chosen as the site for the Olympics before the rise of the Nazi Party. There's highly unlikely they would have chosen Germany or Berlin as the center for the Olympics, given them what's going on. I mean, they just passed a whole series of laws that basically says you're not citizens, you can't marry, you can't be in any of these professions. They certainly wouldn't honor that city and that culture with the worldwide games. The Nazis' persecution of Jews sparked a widespread movement in the United States to boycott the Olympics, which included American athletes who decided they didn't want to be a part of this particular Olympics. To create a positive image for foreign visitors, the Nazis temporarily concealed their anti-Semitic policies. They toned it way down. So if they're at like a 9 or a 10, they moved it down to like a 2 or a 3 or even a 1. They removed signs, they softened the public rhetoric. Jewish athletes were barred from participating on the German team, but they would allow sort of Jewish athletes to participate on foreign teams. The goal was to lay low by hiding propaganda and anti-Semitic policies, and really to present to the world an image of a peaceful people, right? A tolerant Germany to the world during the 1936 Olympics. So some of the things they did is they removed some of the anti-Jewish signs, like public displays, like very, overt displays of anti-Semitism, like Jews are not welcome here. They kind of took those down. Those were eliminated. Signs such as Jews being barred from public parks or spaces, swimming pools, those were temporarily taken down as well. They restrained anti-Jewish activities. So, for example, there was a newspaper called Der Stürmer, which was the attacker, was pulled from public newsstands, and anti-Jewish activities were toned down with directives. All this came from Goebbels, who said, we're going to tone it all down, right? We're going to take down the temperature while the world is watching. Additionally, the Nazis are kind of into pageantry and symbols. So they had these lavish opening ceremonies and these brand new facilities that they had built. And the creation, and get this, the first ever Olympic torch relay, which we're so comfortable with now. Where did that come from? The Nazis started that. They started that relay to link Nazi Germany with the glory of ancient Greece, right? So that, in other words, we are the continuation of this great culture that's here, and to project this image of power and progress. There's a picture that I found there of the Olympic torch, and you can just see all of the Nazi flags there in the background. It's just like, it's hard to fathom that this is the opening of the Olympics, right? I mean, that's the opening Olympics, right? With all that symbolism there. Today, the world would just be absolutely appalled by this, right? But at that time, yeah, okay, it's a new party. Additionally, 1936, the Berlin Games were the first to be televised to the world, broadcasting a curated image of the Nazi regime to a wider audience than ever before. There's 49 nations sending teams. The international community inadvertently kind of legitimized the Nazi Party in the eyes of the world. The positive coverage by many journalists helped repair their damaged reputation after World War I. But once the Olympics were over, the aftermath then began. The brief respite for Jewish people ended abruptly after the Olympics were over. The Nazis resumed and accelerated their persecution of Jews and other enemies of the state right after those Olympics were over. So this is kind of my little quote here. I said, God is not the only one who is patient. The evil one, too, shrewdly waits for the right moment to wreak havoc on people's lives. In other words, he knows when to lay low, and he knows when to hit the gas. And so just keep in mind that he's shrewd, right? The most cunning of all serpents. So he's very patient and will wait for a moment of weakness or when people aren't looking. He waited patiently for the right moment for our first parents, Adam and Eve. So we're going to look at a little bit of propaganda now for you. Following the Nazi seizure of power in 1933, Hitler establishes the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda by Joseph Goebbels. Nazi propaganda was designed to engage emotions, not critical thinking. Just get that kind of in your head. It's about the emotions, not about reasoning, not about thinking. Remember, Goebbels was a master manipulator. In some sense, he's kind of a psychologist, getting into the mind of people, what moves people in some sense. Remember the first time I talked about Goebbels helped develop Hitler's speech skills and tactics, one among many, right? Hitler would practice a long time before he gave these speeches. And Goebbels would say, my Fuhrer, we must appeal to people's emotions, not their intellect, because people are driven by their emotion and not logic. Translate their complex ideas into simple words and use your body language, he said. So propaganda appeals to the emotions, right? Not so much to the intellect. So the goal is to infiltrate the Nazi the message or this false ideology throughout all of culture, art, music, theater, films, books, radio, schools especially, right? Education materials, kids' books, right? Kids' stories books, and the press to shape the minds of millions of Germans and win their hearts. The Nazis presented a visually appealing vision of a new world order, a beautiful world, a utopian world. We would say the Messianic era in some sense, right? A prosperous, racially pure Germany dominating Europe. So you have posters like this of this happy family with children. So on the one hand, you want to hold up the ideal. So Nazi Germans are presented as beautiful, happy, youthful, orderly, right? And appealing to this emotional appeal. And so you see this stuff and you say, I want to be like that. You're tugging the emotions. A child or an elementary school sees a poster and says, I want to be like that. They're appealing to emotions. It's brilliant. Then, on the other hand, you want to demonize, right, the out-group, the scapegoat. Jews are presented as dishonest, dirty, scheming, underhanded, right, detestable, greedy capitalists, or subversive communists. And that you want that emotional appeal to say, ew, they're gross. That's terrible. I don't want to be like that, right? So you have to hold up the ideal on one side, and then you want to kind of repulse the other side. So you have images like this, right? These youthful soldiers who are patriotic, right? They're good shape, they're good looking, right? They're noble, they stand for the country. And then next to it you have something like this Jew, right? And it's obviously drawn like a rat. It's very diabolical. Very sinister. This is something that they did often. Nazi propaganda presented Jews as rats to suggest that they were carriers of diseases of the social order. They were money-mad bits devoid of higher values and corrupters of the world. And I find it ironic. I caught in my research is it's a little bit ironic that the SS used Zyklon B at Auschwitz and other places, which is a pesticide. Right? It's to kill vermin and rats. And this is the very thing they use to kill the Jews in the gas chambers that are there. You also, in addition to presenting them as kind of very undesirable, you also create this kind of scheming, right? This power scheme, this conspiracy. The Nazis proposed fraudulent theories about an international Jewish conspiracy to take over the world, to take over businesses, to take over government. They're taking over media, or they're behind the wars. This conspiracy puts forth that Jews were trying to destroy other world religions and promote wars for their own personal benefit. You probably have heard this book called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, was the most circulated and translated in many languages. It's a book from 1903. Has widespread anti-Semitism, publication of the most in the modern times. The Nazis used this book to spread their hatred and this kind of skepticism and revulsion of the Jewish people. You also have this disloyalty. We've seen this image before. This Austrian postcard of 1919 showing that the caricature of the Jews stabbing a German soldier in the back, the scapegoating, right? We lost the war because of them. There's also a kind of religious, also a persecution or a propaganda. They say, look, the Jews are responsible for the murder of Jesus. It's their fault. And they would say, whenever you see a crucifix, think of a horrible murder of Jesus by the Jews. The church has been very, very emphatic and condemning this. The church has always been very saying, who took the life of Jesus? We did. Our sins, right, did. And first of all, he handed over his life, right, out of infinite love for us. So any type of anti-Semitism is just explicitly condemned, most notably in the Second Vatican Council. You also these blood libel myths. Jews were accused of murdering Christian children, and using their blood in religious ceremonies. And then they were also accused of being greedy, capitalists. They were portrayed Jews as greedy and materialistic. In the film, The Eternal Jew described Jews as these wandering cultural parasites consumed by greed for money. This is a children's book, right? And so children are reading this, and they're seeing this and saying, oh, geez. They're trying to shape and form the minds of young people. Nazi films portray Jews as subhuman creatures infiltrating Aryan society. During World War II, Nazi films depicted the life of Jewish people being resettled to the East for labor. And by the way, you can go on to YouTube and you can watch videos where there's kind of propaganda where they would create these films, because naturally people are saying, well, where are they all going? Like, what's their life like in the East that you're resettling them? And so they would create these propaganda films and show them the German public. They're like, sewing and crafts and together family, and they're dressed, pretty well. And they say, oh, okay, they're doing pretty well there. What they didn't know is that all the people in that film are now dead, right? Because they've all been pushed through the concentration camp, through the gas chambers. They painted a picture of happy families, communities who are learning and working together. You have newspapers. This newspaper, The Attacker, printed cartoons that used anti-Semitic characters to depict Jews. A German newspaper depicted Jews as being subhuman and enemies of the Third Reich after Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939. You have radio. The radio became a worldwide phenomenon in the 1920s. People could listen to the news and entertainment in their own homes. The Nazis commissioned a low-cost radio called the People's Receiver to allow millions of Germans to buy radios and listen from their homes. And of course, what are they going to do? They use this as a medium, right, for their propaganda. Today, if this were happening today, they would use the internet. They would use social media. They would use AI. They would use everything at their disposal for their particular agenda. So before the Nuremberg Laws, the Nazis created an atmosphere of tolerant violence against the Jews. But after the invasion of Russia, they linked Soviet communism with European Jewry. Germany was the defender of Western culture against the Judeo-Bolshevik threat, painting an apocalyptic picture if the Soviets won the war. Like, they'll take over everything, right? A little bit about Kristallnacht is the Night of the Broken Glass. It's very famous. It's a violent pogrom, an anti-Semitic pogrom against it happened throughout Nazi Germany and Austria as well, and the Sudetenland on November 8th and 9th in 1938. This is the first kind of widespread display of mass violence against the Jews since the humiliations and boycott of 1933. It was a break with rational anti-Semitism that the Nazis had been following, very progressive, rational, of trying to exclude them. And now there's this kind of outbreak of violence. The immediate pretext for the pogrom was the assassination of a German diplomat, Ernst von Rath, in Paris on November 7th, 1938, by Herschel Grinspan, a 17-year-old Polish student who was very mad about his family, basically being stripped of their rights, right? His family was deported from Germany to Poland, and Poland said, we don't want him. So this poor family's kind of stuck between these two countries. And he's like, well, the world isn't paying attention, so I'm going to make some noise here. So I'm going to kill the diplomat, for Germany. And so the Nazis use this as a pretext or a reason to have this outbreak of violence against the Jewish people. So the pogrom was not a spontaneous outrage, but rather a state-sponsored vandalism and arson. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels and other top Nazis, and especially Reinhard Heydrich, actively coordinated the riot with the support of Nazi leader Adolf Hitler. Nazi officials and members of the paramilitary, the SA and SS, Hitler Youth, and sometimes civilians joined in this pogrom. But the word pogrom is a Russian word. It's like a violent outburst. I can't remember the actual technical term for it, but it's typically this kind of unleashing of anger, right, in some sense, this violence against the Jewish people. More than 1,500 synagogues are vandalized or burned to the ground in the Kristallnacht. Firefighters are ordered to let the synagogues burn, but to prevent flames from spreading to nearby non-Jewish properties. Imagine 1,500 synagogues. We don't have that many Catholic parishes, even probably in Minnesota, right? This is a lot of synagogues that are burning to the ground. Jewish businesses, thousands of Jewish-owned businesses were destroyed and looted. The streets were left covered with shattered glass from the store windows, which gave the event its name. Jews were viciously attacked, publicly humiliated, and close to 100 were murdered during the pogrom. Mass arrests, approximately 30,000 Jewish men were rounded up and sent to Nazi concentration camps, one of them being Dachau, making the first time the regime imprisoned Jews on a mass scale based solely on their identity. Following Kristallnacht, the famous Goering, chairs a meeting with top Nazi officials on November 12th, 3 days later, that he would order and discipline, not rioting, and efficiency, not financial expense, must be our policy moving forward. In other words, slow down, be patient. We'll get there, right? It's going to be more systematic. It's going to be more covert, and that shouldn't be out in the open like that. So after Kristallnacht, Goering warned of a final reckoning with the Jews. And we're going to see next time he sends a letter to Heydrich, and he says, I want you to come up with a solution. We need a final solution to this people. And that's the Wannsee conference they're calling together. Kristallnacht fundamentally changed or altered the situation for Jews under Nazi Germany and shocked the international community, though little was done to help. Following the Evian conference in July of 1938, this is really a sad sort of commentary for the world at the time. We had 32 nations that were there, and basically all of them were like, well, this isn't good, we don't like this, but we're not willing to change our policies. We don't want them either, right? So they would not change their immigration policies. And so the only country that did was the Dominican Republic. It said, we'll take 100,000, right? But the United States did not. They said, we're not going to take any more. Most countries, Australia went, said, nope, we don't want any. So nobody wanted them. I read a little thing that said if every country had been willing to take 17,000 Jews, every Jew would have been saved, right? They could have got them all out if they would have let them take them, if the countries would have allowed them to come in. Here, the extreme violence of the pogrom made it clear to many German Jews that we have no future in this country. And now they're wanting to get out. The Nazis imposed a crippling 1 billion Reichsmark fine on the Jewish community for the damage caused. In other words, we're the ones who did it. We broke all your glass. We burned down your synagogues. We destroyed your businesses, and now you have to pay for it. Talk about sticking something in your eye afterward, right? They also, new laws and further excluded Jews from economic life, including banning them from operating businesses or holding managerial positions. I mean, all the writing's on the wall at this point, right? Like, we have got to get out of here, right? The problem is countries don't want to take them. And second is, was it 1941, I think? Himmler made it illegal to emigrate, to leave the country. Like, at some point he said, you're all staying here, and we're going to deal with you the way we want to deal with you, right? This is the end of the illusions for many German Jews. Kristallnacht really destroyed any remaining hope that they could live safely in Germany. The indifference of the non-Jewish citizenry to the atrocities was a stark realization that they were very unwelcome. We really have the pathway starting to be carved out, the snows being plowed for the Holocaust. The Kristallnacht served as a stark preview of the Nazi regime's intent and capacity for extreme violence. The persecution of Jews intensified dramatically afterward, setting the stage for the systematic deportations and mass murder of the Holocaust. In addition to this outbreak, this pogrom of violence on November 8th and 9th, 1938, they then start to ramp things up even further. We have had boycotts. We've had laws to isolate them. We've stomped on them, their faces, with a psychological sort of use of means of propaganda. We've now had violent outbursts against you. And now, to add to it, we're going to make you wear visible signs in the late 1930s and 40s. So in August of 1938, a decree forced all Jews with non-Jewish first names to add Israel for men and Sarah for women to their legal name. Their passports in October of 1938, a law required them Jewish-owned passports to be stamped with a large red letter J for Jude, right, Jew. And then in 1941, September 19th, Jews aged 6 years and older in the German Reich and its annexed territories now have to wear a yellow star on the left side of their clothing. The six-pointed star of the David badge, and Heydrich is the one who made this particular decree. The star was to be palm-sized. It was on the left side of the chest. It had to have the word Jude, and to stick it to them even further, they made it in Hebrew sort of type, script, inscribed within it in a font that mimicked Hebrew letters. The Jewish community was forced to manufacture and distribute the badges themselves. And you got to make them, right? But you have to wear them. This star, it's difficult to overemphasize what this did psychologically to Jews, right? You're wearing something clearly now as a stigma for you. This made them feel easily identifiable, isolated from their non-Jewish neighbors. In many cases, this led to increased harassment and anti-Semitic attacks. The visible stars were meant not only to easily identify them, but to humiliate them and dehumanize them. The goal was to strip them of their dignity, to facilitate the idea that you are different and you are other. Those who refused to wear the stars, you were severely punished, or at least you could be, including fines, beatings, imprisonment, and even possible death. In concentration camps, we all know that the Jews and other groups were marked with color-coded badges. In many of the camps, the Jews had the yellow triangle for the Jewish prisoners. At Auschwitz, I think Auschwitz is the only place they actually tattooed, I think it was a left arm, with a number, right? So you now were a number rather than a name. And you were always to be identified by that particular number on the left forearm. So after conquering Poland, the Nazis began setting up Jewish ghettos across Eastern Europe from October 1939 to 1941. We first ghetto is set up there in Poland in October 1939 after the Germans had invaded. And then these two other major ghettos, this Lodz and Warsaw, are both set up in 1940, one in April and one in October, Warsaw being the largest. So the ghettos, what they help do is they help the Nazis with the process of separating the Jews, of controlling and ultimately to their annihilation. The ghettos were intended to be a temporary measure for controlling and segregating them. They were systematically liquidated beginning in 1942, when the Nazis began deporting their inhabitants to extermination camps. If you've seen Schindler's List, there's a scene in the movie that is very moving and very realistic and well done. Steven Spielberg did a good job, where Schindler is on the hill with his sort of, it's not his wife, it's one of his girlfriends, and he's watching down on this village as the Nazis chose a particular night to liquidate the ghetto. And it's just a horrific scene, right? There's just terror in all the streets as they round up all the Jews. And Jews are trying to either escape, or they're trying to, some are going to the sewer, some are hanging under beds, they're trying to find hiding spots. And the ones that do try to hide are immediately killed, right? They kill them. And then they would come in at night, right, with the stethoscope, looking for any breathing or heartbeat from them. They're trying to get every single last one of them. And there's that scene also where the Nazi soldier is playing the piano. Remember that? As they're shooting up all the Jews on the different floors that are there. So it's just this kind of reign of terror that you see, and it's very well depicted in the Schindler's List. Ghettos were enclosed districts, often walled or sealed with barbed wire, and any Jew found outside the perimeter risked being shot. This isolation severed Jewish communities from the outside world and limited opportunities for smuggling food, medicine, and information. The overcrowding it was horrific. Severely overcrowded. Dozens of people sometimes sharing a single room. In the Warsaw Ghetto alone, it was an area of 1.3 square miles that had 25,000 people before they established the ghetto. With creating this Warsaw Ghetto, more than 400,000 Jews lived in this tiny postage stamp square space. You tell me you're not going to have problems? Like if you just pack people in there with starvation, with disease, with violence that are there. There was only 2 water pits, 3 families with children to a room. They never slept. Starvation and disease. Deliberate policies of starvation coupled with squalid conditions led to rampant disease, especially typhus, which killed tens of thousands of people. And as the years and months and years went on, it just got worse and worse and worse. And sometimes you see in some of these videos, they have the death cart that would come out every morning and literally pick up dead bodies, right? And many of them were naked because they were stripped of their clothing, right? They steal all their clothing, they'd be stripped, just picking up dead bodies. Right? It's just a horrific, horrific scene. The Nazis exploited ghetto inhabitants as a source of cheap labor, forced labor for German factories, with some ghetto leaders believing that productivity might secure the ghetto's survival. And then they put these Jewish councils in charge of these particular ghettos to manage these things, right? To run these particular things, kind of distance themselves from the people on the ground, and then they would just work through the Jewish councils. Really a precursor to how they would run the camps, right? So we're going to see in the camps that the Nazis, what they did, the SS, is they would have all of the Jewish prisoners called the Sonderkommando, which is they did all the dirty work. So they'd have them doing the dirty work with the crematorium, putting the people in there, moving the bodies up to the ovens, and then disposing of the ashes. The Nazis didn't do that. They had them do that, right? The only thing the Nazis would do is they would be the ones who always shook the Zyklon Bien. But they distanced themselves from the dirty work. Why? Psychological. It doesn't take a toll. I distance myself from it. This allows us to keep going at it. Because remember, the bullets was very, very difficult on the soldiers. They were drinking and there's suicide, and there's all kinds of problems. So they said, we got to come up with a system to distance ourselves from the evil, that we can do this on a mass scale. Very, very shrewd, very diabolical, very, very, very sinister. Warsaw Ghetto, established in October 1940. The Warsaw Ghetto is the largest ghetto in all of Nazi-occupied Europe. As many as 460,000 Jews were crowded into this small area. Of course, it's decimated by starvation, disease, mass deportations. The Treblinka, we're going to talk about Treblinka, is probably not as well known. That was an extermination camp alone. So there were some camps that were just forced labor. There were some camps that were hybrids, like Auschwitz was a hybrid camp. And then there were some camps, it was literally extermination. That's all they did. They'd bring them in on the train. Within 2 hours, they'd be dead. And at Treblinka, 800,000 Jews were killed. 99.9999% of people died. I mean, it's like less than, like virtually nobody survived, right? They just were all, and then they would have the workers, and they'd keep rotating them out, right? So every couple of weeks, they would exterminate them and bring in new workers as well. Just horrific, absolutely horrific. The Lodz Ghetto is created February 1940. It's the second largest ghetto. It was exceptionally isolated and became a major production center for the Germans under the leadership of this gentleman here, who used a policy of rescue through work. This is the last ghetto in Poland to be liquidated, while the remaining residents deported to Auschwitz in, I think it's Jelmo, in August of 1944. The Jewish question hundreds of thousands of Jews died in ghettos from disease, starvation, cold, unprovoked violence, even suicide. As the Germans continued to conquer the territories in the east, more and more Jews start to come under their control, right? So every time they're conquering a place, they're bringing Jews under their control. There are about 3 million Jews in Poland and 5 million in Russia. What do you do with them? So this pressing question kept coming up. It's called the Jewish question. What should be done with them? As we'll see next time, shooting was messy. It was distressing. It was inefficient. Another solution, one that required careful planning, was needed. This is one of the most bizarre sort of things they thought about doing for a while. The Madagascar plan. You're like, what? Like, they actually, for a while, entertained the possibility of taking all the Jews and shipping them off to the island of Madagascar. This was proposed in 1940. We're going to forcibly deport the entire population of Europe to the island of Madagascar. This plan was primarily developed by the officials of the Reich Security Main Office and the German Foreign Office. They conceived this kind of territorial solution to the Jewish question. So they would force them, they would intended to see, first of all, we're going to take over the island, which was a French colony at the time. We're going to resell the entire European Jewish population there. Under the version of the plan produced by Adolf Eichmann, the island would be then governed as a police state run by the SS. The cost of the plan was going to be covered by liquidating all their property, selling it, and then using that to finance to get them to Madagascar. I mean, this is the craziest idea. The plan then was to contain them on this island under harsh conditions, and then they expected them to have massive deaths through disease, malnutrition, and other factors. Ultimately, though, the plan was abandoned for a number of reasons. One is the British Royal Navy was still in control of the seas, so that was a problem, getting them there. Additionally, things started to focus towards the east in 1941 with Operation Barbarossa and taking and invading Russia. So their attention began to shift to the east, not to the west. So they said, let's find an approach not at Madagascar, let's find something in the east. And they, of course, we know they're going to settle on Poland, right, as this place where these camps are all going to be set up. So we're going to see next time this Wannsee conference, after banning the Madagascar plan, top officials will convene in January 1942 to coordinate this final solution to the Jewish question. The final solution was the code name for the systematic state-sponsored genocide of European Jews, which was carried out primarily through the use of extermination camps. That's a picture there of Reinhard Heydrich, right, who is a very nasty man. He's cold-hearted, the butcher of Prague, the man with the iron heart, as Hitler referred to him. The man had no scruples or morals whatsoever. If that guy had not been assassinated by those two British intelligentsia, God only knows how much worse things would have been, because he's a mastermind, right, in terms of his the Gestapo and the secret, the SD, the secret police. Look at that. That's where they had the conference. There, it's a suburb. I think it's a western suburb of Berlin. It's a villa, and it's actually a villa that Heydrich liked, and he himself wanted to basically, purchase this, and he used this as his own home following the war. So he calls these top-ranking Nazi officials to all meet there to coordinate efforts for this solution to the Jewish question. By the way, people can go there, and you can take a tour, and you can read sort of what happened there. In an hour and a half, next time, an hour and a half, they decided the fate of what they believe was 11 million people over crystal, fine food. It's just horrific, absolutely horrific. And by the way, we'll talk about next time, is they had all these copies that they went over, right, of the sort of thing, and they were all destroyed except for one. One made it out. And we're very, and sometimes grateful, because we can now read exactly what the minutes were and what happened at that particular conference. In closing, I just want to touch on a few things, how evil escalates over time, a Christian anti-Semitism, traditional versus modern, and then just one page on Pope Pius XI's encyclical, where he asked all Catholic priests to read from on Palm Sunday in 1937. So there are various forms of violence, and I think it's very important for you to understand this. There's what's called psychological violence, which is using derogatory words, name-calling, dehumanizing labels. When you label people and you say you're this, rats, vermin, dirty, today they say, bigot, right, all this stuff. This is psychological warfare. To strip them of their dignity. Jews are no longer seen as human with faces, with families and names, but rather is presented as some human. That's a psychological warfare. That's a type of violence that's had. There's also moral violence. After they strip them of their dignity, they are then turned into enemies, threatening the social fabric and state. Therefore, they deserve the harm that they receive. Like, you deserve this. This is your fault. For Nazis, it became morally justified to act violently against them. You have emotional, physical, and even sexual violence. Psychological and moral violence lead to increased aggression. A new environment with Kristallnacht, where outbursts of physical violence and the possibility of physical segregation become a reality. And then finally, you're the final step of the extermination camps. My point is, this stuff escalates, right? It's like a frog in a water. You keep turning up the heat, right? And as long as good people don't say anything, it's going to continue to become more aggressive. I just want to point out to you also, a priest friend of mine pointed this out to me. He goes, there is a difference between Christian anti-Semitism, which in the Catholic tradition is never called for, and what we call the sort of modern anti-Semitism. Historically, there's always been kind of a tension, a little bit of a tension between Jewish people and the Christians. It's understandable. Tension's not a bad thing. It's just tension. The tension is that, obviously Jews believe that Christians follow a false Messiah, while Christians believe that Jews have rejected the true Messiah, right? So there's going to be a little bit of tension in those belief systems. It's just unfortunate that that tension historically has led to violence and persecution when it doesn't have to. And violence by both sides have been guilty on this now. For the first 3 centuries, the Jewish people very much outnumbered Christians. Christians were very much a small minority. And for those first 3 centuries, many times, the Jewish people did persecute Christians pretty badly. But since the 4th century, when Christians caught up with the Jews in numbers, Christians periodically have, unfortunately, persecuted Jews as well. Both sides have been guilty at times in history. Nobody's completely innocent. There have been bad actors, bad apples on both sides. In the modern era, the church has strongly condemned anti-Semitism again and again and again as unbecoming of being a Christian, and even come to respect Jews as part of God's covenant family. The tension at times that has led to violence and persecution were always over beliefs, though. They're not about race or ethnicity. Today, Christians recognize God's actions through the Jews in human history. They respect that, those covenants. And they also respect the Jewish scriptures, or the Old Testament is divinely inspired, and we're grateful for that. Now, the fact that the church has condemned anti-Semitism, there's an encyclical in 1937 that came out. And this is the very end of the papacy of Pius XI, before shortly in 1939, I think it was March of 1939, when Pius XII comes onto the scene. Pius XI writes an encyclical in German with burning desire, burning anxiety, it's called. Copies were snuck into Catholic parishes where it was to be read from Catholic pulpits in German on Palm Sunday, criticizing the Nazi cult, neo-paganism, and the idolization of the state and the myth of the race and blood. This encyclical inserted that human beings have an inherent rights from God that no collectivity can suppress. The encyclical also argued that Nazism is not the moral standard and that it would lead to perpetual international conflict. So every Catholic parish, and just right before Holy Week, the Palm Sunday as it begins, is to read, in some sense, this encyclical to the people. And you can imagine that the Nazis were furious about this. Very, very unhappy. How dare you do this? And this is showing you here that the church is not on board. I would say that modern anti-Semitism is different. It's different because than historical Christian anti-Semitism. Whereas historically Christian anti-Semitism was religious, or you could say anti-Judaism because of religious belief, modern anti-Semitism is based more on political, racial, and nationalistic ideas. Below reasons on the natural level, the jealousy, maybe they're extraordinarily successful, right? Or they're instruments of oppression, whatever it is, the reasons given. The deeper reason is that Jews are a sacramental reminder that God alone is God and his plan of salvation will prevail. In short, it's a spiritual comeback. So there's a hatred, not so much of your belief, but you as a people, right? This biology. That's more the modern mentality that you're seeing. While modern anti-Semites may not be able to articulate it, they subconsciously are aware that with all the complexity of world events, all the geopolitical, economic concerns of peoples and cultures, the real history of the world is the history of God's dealing with us. The Jews, including their history and presence as a community, are kind of an oblique sign that God is alive and well, and that he alone should be worshipped, and we are not. Hence, in the modern progressive mindset, the Jews are hated and therefore they must be progressive. That's why they're not liked, right? They're a reminder of the goodness of God and that God acts in history. The next time we get together, we're going to look at the Wannsee Conference. We're going to look at the Holocaust by bullets. We're going to look at the extermination camps. And then if we have time, because it's a long presentation next time, we'll also look at Pope Pius XII and his interaction as well. If I don't get to that next time, we'll tack it on to the next time because it's such a long presentation. But I just finished writing it today. I just sent it over to Dr. Tod. And I have to be honest with you, when I got done with it, I just wanted to go have a drink or take a walk, it's just awful. But you learn, we have to learn from this stuff. You have to, and also, I want to put out there, this is why we fought the war. We say, we will not tolerate that. We will not tolerate that, and that's what we're fighting against, right? And that's why we're grateful to our troops and to all these wonderful troops who have given so much, many of them their lives, their bloodshed, the sacrifice, of leaving their home for this very reason, to defend what's good, beautiful, true, authentic freedom, the freedom to worship, of respecting one another. That's what our country's been about, So we're going to look at the American sort of involvement in the war, but you have to understand the bad news and really understand it and go at it before you can really appreciate the good news and appreciate what we're fighting against. Otherwise, you say, I don't know if it's really worth it. And you can say, it's worth it, and that much more. This is a cancer on the human race and society, and it must be obliterated, gotten rid of. And that's what our troops fought for. And we can be thankful to our grandpas, our grandmas, and all these American troops who gave thousands and thousands of lives for us. Okay, I have been exactly, look at that, 2 hours, right on the nose. I don't know if Dr. Tod wants to come up at all, or if he has any questions at all. Do you have any comments at all, Doc, that you want to say for this particular session at all? Nothing at all? Do you want just a blessing and you want to ask me questions, us privately, so you can all go home? Okay, the Lord be with you. Through the intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary, all the angels, all the saints, including St. Therese and her family, may mighty God bless you today and always. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you for your attention and your time. In 2 weeks, we'll do the Holocaust. You will not want to miss it. Trust me, okay? All right.